Guys, welcome back. I'm Amanda. So today is all about repotting. Now I have this giant philodendron, this rojo Congo or Congo rojo, whatever you want to say. This has been needing a repot for, I don't know, 5 months now. I've been kind of just putting it off, but it's definitely time. So if you're kind of unfamiliar with repotting in general, or it makes you kind of nervous, we're gonna go over everything having to do with when and how to repot your soil and whether or not you should use a stake of any type or a moss pole, whatever you like. Now the first thing to figure out is when do I need to repot? For the most part, most of your plants don't need to be repotted every few weeks or every couple months. A lot of them can be good in their pot for like 5, 6+ months. So that should already let you know that you don't need to be repotting all the time. Repotting too often can definitely come with its own problems. All you're gonna do is stress out your plant, so you really shouldn't repot unless you absolutely need to. Now when we repot, we're only doing so because the plant has outgrown its pot. So of course the easiest way to tell is if you see roots coming out of the bottom drainage holes of your pots. Now not all your plants are going to do that, so don't just rely on waiting to see roots coming out of the bottoms. Your plant's roots could very easily be wound up on the inside of the pot and still not coming out of the bottom, so that's definitely not a 100% sure way to tell if it's time. Now another way to tell, which is a little bit more reliable, is looking at the growth of your plant. So if you know you have no pests on that plant or diseases, and you know that you're pretty good at keeping it on schedule with watering and sunlight, it's in the best conditions possible, yet you're still not really getting much leaf growth, and or you're getting small leaf sizes compared to before, that could definitely be a sign that it's time to repot. Your plant has now become sort of stunted in its pot, so it's definitely letting you know that your plant has outgrown that pot and it's time to upsize. And I'm sure you'll come across some things online saying don't repot in the winter time, but if we're talking about indoor plants here, they're not really subject to the weather and nature outside. Your plant is likely in the same environment year round, so repotting in the wintertime is totally fine. Now the next thing for repotting is how do I know how big to go? So it's normally recommended to upsize about 1 to 2 times the size of the previous pot, but that's not always the case. You don't want to just upsize 1 to 2 times the pot size just because that's recommended. It definitely really matters on what your roots look like. So I have this philodendron right here. I'm not going to take it out of the pot, but I already have an idea of what the roots look like because this did recently get uppotted, and this doesn't have a huge root system. So if I were just to take this plant and just double it or just go up 1 to 1.5 sizes, that would definitely be way too much room for the amount of roots that are actually in the pot. So that's what I mean when I say be careful, because it's definitely not good to have your plant swimming in a huge pot. Most of the time that just means you're more likely to get root rot, unfortunately. So definitely consider your root size as well as the plant size when uppotting. Now on the other hand, it is normally okay to go slightly larger on the pot size, but only in certain circumstances and if you are pretty good at not overwatering your plants. So take this philodendron for example. This is the pot size that it is currently in, and this, I have soil in it. This is the pot size it's being upgraded to. So you could definitely say that the new pot size is 2 times or maybe a tad bit more larger than the original pot. As you can tell, this is a pretty mature philodendron, and I feel totally comfortable with upgrading it to a larger pot, knowing that I won't have to upsize it again for even longer because I'm already putting it in a large pot. And because it is so mature and established, I know that the root system is pretty good in there and it's gonna do very well inside a larger pot. So yeah, if upgrading to slightly larger than 2 times the size or right around 2 times the size makes you nervous, then definitely don't. Just be on the safe side and just do like 1 to 1.5 times larger than your previous pot size. I have all this stuff here to block her, and she keeps trying to get in, but she destroys everything. Now for this specific plant, like I said, I know it's time to repot. One, because the new leaves coming in are pretty small. Now this would normally be a decent sized leaf, but compared to the previous leaf growth, even that one was looking a little smaller. Here's a good example of what it looked like when it was doing okay in this pot versus now. So definitely a huge difference. So that's one for sure way I know that it's time to repot. And I've been meaning to repot anyway because as you can tell, it's leaning. It's getting too top heavy. I need to stake it. And while staking it, I'm just gonna uppot it. So next we have soil. So when choosing your soil, you probably want to stick to something that was somewhat similar to what it was in before, only if that previous soil was a pretty decent soil mix. Now you don't have to get fancy. I definitely do my soil mix kind of on a budget. I use perlite, peat moss, and sand. And I use the fine grained sand. You can kind of see it in there. Now I try to do this part as cleanly as possible, but of course, it doesn't always work that way. So when removing your plant, you obviously don't want to use too much force. We don't want to rip our plants out. What I find works well is dumping some soil out and just kind of wiggling. Also, if your plant is extremely root bound and you really don't want to risk destroying the root system, it is worth it to consider cutting open your pot, especially if you're just using those black plastic nursery pots. It may seem wasteful to cut open a pot to remove a plant, but when it's that or destroying a fragile root system, then it's definitely something to consider. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Oh. Yeah. Okay, now our next step is having our pot prepared, and then that brings us into staking. So if you're not planning to stake your plant that you're repotting, then definitely don't worry about this. But if you are, there are different options that you can take when staking. So obviously you can use a moss pole, you can use planks of wood, you can also use some type of metal trellis I've seen a lot of people use, or you could kind of make your own thing. A lot of people do that as well, repurposing a bunch of stuff in order to make a trellis. Now I happen to have a lot of these thin pieces of wood from my gardening projects, and I'm just gonna use these. Now when choosing your stake or pole, whatever you want to use, you obviously want to make sure it's larger than your plant so there's room for the plant to grow. And when it comes to wood planks of any type, you can't just add on connector pieces, although maybe you could, but probably wouldn't look as nice. But when you're dealing with those detachable, stackable moss pole things, then that's definitely easier to just add on to. So I like to insert my stake first and then add the plant because it just makes it a little bit easier. So next we're gonna grab our plant and just kind of plop that in. So it really doesn't look too pretty yet, but that's okay. So there are also differing opinions on whether or not you should loosen the root ball up. I like to, especially when it's extremely root bound. I don't go too crazy about it because again, I don't want to rip apart roots and stuff. I just loosen it a little bit. I'm gonna do my best here to center this and get the pole lined up. Another thing with repotting, you want to repot about the same depth that the plant was at before. So depending on the plant, but for example, for this philodendron, I don't want to cover up this whole stem or the stalk, if you will, especially because it wasn't growing like that before. And this plant doesn't really grow like that naturally anyway. Its stalk is usually out in the air, not covered by soil. Like I said, doing our best to make sure it's centered, and to me that looks pretty good. I'm not too picky about it. I just kind of eyeball it. Now, when it comes to staking, you can use those little twisty ties, the Velcro straps that they make, or you can use twine. You can even use those tomato safe ties that are pretty thin in material. I forget what they're called. I just use twine because I happen to have a lot of it on hand. And staking is pretty easy at this point. All you gotta do is tie it up to your pole. Now it's important that you don't tie so tight that you're constricting the plant, just tight enough to where it can hold itself to the stake. And as your plant gets acclimated to its new pole, especially if it's never been on one before, the roots will start attaching to whatever it's growing onto. Of course, if you're using a moss pole, that attaching might happen a lot sooner than it would with something like this, like wood, but it definitely will still attach to a wooden stake. So I already tied up the main stalk right here, but I am gonna loosely, very loosely tie these two back leaves to here just for a little bit better stabilization. And then you can definitely cut off the ugly ends so it looks a little bit nicer. So now that the repotting and the staking are finished, the last thing to do is water. So normally for a plant this large, I would take it into my tub and hose it down in there, but I kind of don't feel like doing that right now. Pose. Okay, so this is
it. It is repotted, restaked. After you repot, it might take a little bit longer for new growth to come in. Just give the plant time to get acclimated to being in a new pot. Also consider all the stress that the plant went under when repotting. So it's really important after you repot to not do anything crazy. Put it in the same spot it was before. Keep watering the same. Don't do anything too extreme to add further stress. And again, just be patient. Some plants take a little bit longer to bounce back after repotting. And it definitely has some room to grow. So that's exciting and convenient because I won't have to restake for a while.
All right, so that's it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I appreciate any support, even comments. And thanks for watching. I'll see you later. Bye.